Hello, Rebels of the Sherpa. Normally, I start off this podcast by saying hi, but I'm going to start this one off by saying hydration. We know how important hydration is for our bodies. It's the thing that keeps us running, right? You want to be a well-oiled machine. You want to be running efficiently. You know what can help you run efficiently? Liquid IV. It is the category-winning hydration brand fueling your well-being, and their hydration multiplier is the one product that you are missing in your daily routine. It comes in a little stick that's a powder, and in just one stick, you get 5 essential vitamins and 2 times faster hydration than water alone. If you use it first thing in the morning, maybe before a workout, when you feel run down, maybe after a long night out and doing a little partying, you know what I mean? And even, what if you have like a long flight or something like that and you just, bleh, right? We all feel that way, bleh. So add this to your water, and that convenient packaging can go with you anywhere you go, even if you're going to the gym or you're traveling or you're at work and maybe you didn't have a great breakfast. At least it's something that will fuel you up in the morning. And there's a whole bunch of flavors that are available, like sea berry, strawberry lemonade, Concord grape, lemon lime, pina colada, tropical punch, watermelon, strawberry, passion fruit, guava, acai berry. Did I say that right? I never know how to say that. But those are just some of the flavors. Here's some statistics for you folks. 1 stick of liquid IV in 16 ounces of water contains 5 essential vitamins: B3, B5, B6, B12, and even vitamin C. And we all know how important those B vitamins are. It's got 3 times the electrolytes of traditional sports drinks. It's made with premium ingredients. It's non-GMO, and it is free from gluten, dairy, and soy. I'm going to offer you a great deal, Rebels. If you go to liquidiv.com and use offer code Sherpa, you can get 20% off of anything that you order on that site when you're shopping for some better hydration. So that's Liquid IV. Check it out at liquidiv.com. Podcast that you're listening to is being presented to you in cooperation with the SJ Network. If you're a person who'd like to appear on a podcast, contact Stephen Joyner at s-j-network.com. Let's get on with the show.
Today's guest on Too Many Podcasts is Tony Mazur, who hosts the Check Your Brain podcast. Tony is also a stand-up comic and has worked in sports radio.
Have you noticed how many new sports there are lately? This weekend they're televising the World Origami Championship.
But you can only see it on pay-per-view.
Welcome to Too Many Podcasts, the podcast about podcasts. Now, podcasting from the Sherpa Chalet on Mount Podcastia, here's your host, Jim, the Podcast Sherpa.
Hello there, Rebels of the Sherpa, and welcome to Too Many Podcasts. It is the podcast about podcasts and so much more. I haven't done it like that, so why not? Let's try it today. And welcome to you, Jim the Podcast Sherpa here, coming to you from the Sherpa Chalet atop beautiful Mount Podcastia, where you and I will spend a little time together, and we will explore the hills and valleys of this wonderful mountain and get to know some podcasters along the way, like the one I'm talking to you today.
Who's our guest today, Sherpa?
His name is Tony Mazur, and he is the host of a podcast called Check Your Brain. And it is a podcast where he really talks about all sorts of stuff. And not to disappoint, he definitely talked about a lot of interesting stuff in the course of our interview. And not only that, folks, you gotta love the guy for the obscure impressions that he threw on here. If you're not a native New Yorker and you don't know who Don Imus is or Norm Macdonald, you like his impressions, along with a few other ones that he snuck in there. Definitely a fun conversation, very interesting. This is probably one of my favorite interviews that I've done this season with a podcaster. And you'll see what I mean when you listen to this interview. So we'll spend a little time getting to know Tony and all of the different things that he had something to say about. The guy said before the interview started, he said, "Don't worry, I've got plenty to talk about. There's no dead air with me." And there certainly was not. No dead air in this interview. No. Oh, let's have a listen to my conversation with Tony Mazur of the Check Your Brain podcast. And right after that, we will be diving into Sherpa Samples. Hello there, Rebels. We are here in the brain checking room of the Sherpa Chalet. My guest today is Mr. Tony Mazur. He is the host of the podcast Check Your Brain. Tony is a former radio personality and stand-up comedian, and now podcaster. Gets tacked onto that resume as well. And he's been going on for about a good 2 years or so, and about 150 so episodes at the time of this recording. Tony, welcome to the show.
Well, I'm happy to be here. Yeah, it's actually going on 3 years now. I've been doing this since, with all the craziness that happened out of 2020, and I needed an outlet. So I decided to start a podcast just like everybody else. My whole thing at the beginning was, what am I going to do a podcast about? Everybody has a podcast about something, and everybody wants to be Joe Rogan. Everyone wants to be Adam Carolla or Mark Maron. Like, what's going to set me apart? And then I realized it's not that I needed to be set apart. It's I needed some kind of therapy. 2020, it was like, I need to talk to somebody, but there's no therapist that's not on. I'm like, then I'll just be my own therapist and just put a podcast out there. I don't care if no one listens. I need to get some off my chest. That's what I did. Most
of your early ones were mostly solo episodes, and then you started bringing in guests to the show.
Yeah, what I do. So I have a Patreon. It's a quick plug, and we'll get to it at the end, but patreon.com/Tony Mazur, TonyMazur. And usually on my Patreon, I do my solo episodes because I'm just sitting around, and the free episodes, the ones that go out weekly, I usually get a guest. I would say probably at a 52 weeks, I'll probably get about 30, 35 guests a year. And then other times where there's a big news story or something that I just have on my mind, I would get to in the podcast. So I'm trying to grow it. We're all in this business. It's not even a competitive business anymore. In fact, it's actually, as somebody who had come up in the media industry, it was always like, oh, you're fighting against the station down the dial, or you're a TV person. You're like, we got to beat them in the ratings or else we're going to lose our jobs. We're in this together. Like, really should be lifting each other up. And that's why I'm happy to do podcasts. I'm happy to have other podcasters come on my show and getting an opportunity to talk to interesting people. Because even though we're all trying to do something interesting and make our names known, we're also kind of in this together, and we're fighting against the old mediums.
Yeah, that's true. I guess it's probably not as competitive because, with every show that airs, everybody wants to make theirs stand out in some different way. Where radio, it's like, well, you're all playing top 40, so you're playing the same artists and you're promoting the same artists, or you're playing all rock. Where with podcasts, we could both be doing true crime, but I might have one where I talk to the victims, and you have one where you've got the occult version of the story or something like that. So there's really no threat. So we'll just kind of build each other up.
Yeah, or sports. It's like I could talk about what Draymond Green has been up to lately and him getting suspended, or I can talk about classic Golden State Warriors players from the 70s. Oh, Nate Thurmond, he was a great ball player, that kind of stuff. So it's nice to have this much option. I guess the problem with this many options is it does water down the product, where as a podcaster, let's be honest, unless you're Tim Dillon, unless you're Rogan, unless you're one of these big guys, you're probably not going to make a lot of money in this business. You're doing so as a labor of love. So how much do you enjoy listening to yourself talk? And that's what it comes down to. If you do, then start a podcast. It's basically all you need is I've got a USB microphone. You don't even need that. You just need a camera and put it on YouTube.
That is true. So when you were in radio, what kind of music did you play?
Well, so when I started in radio, so I'm 35. I got started almost as soon as I got out of high school. I did it about 15 years. I worked in sports radio. I originally wanted to be one of these, hey, let's go to, not the morning zoo guy, but I wanted to be maybe shock jockery. I was raised on Howard Stern, Opie and Anthony, but I also like politics and radio and stuff. But I wanted to be the guy that you wake up and, he talks about boobs and everything and sports and getting drunk. And somebody told me really early on that very soon there's going to be a different market and you will be able to get music at any way. He's like, these iPods that are around. I'm like, yeah, I have an iPod. It has like 1,000 songs or 500 songs. They're like, pretty soon you can have unlimited songs. Like, unlimited songs? And he's like, and therefore, if you have unlimited music, what's the point of working at a radio station where there's commercials and they have to edit the music? So there's no cursing in this. You can listen to your Rage Against the Machine uncensored, and then the next song is another Rage Against the Machine song, or it could be something else. So he's like, if you're going to be in this business, you should do something that is going to set you apart, be unique, where they can't really let you go right away and can't just use computers and automation. And he said sports radio is the best option. So I started working in sports radio for a number of years. And to be honest, like sports. I played it in high school. I just always got bored with sports radio. So if I joined the business, I wanted to do sports radio that somebody like me could enjoy, where you can talk about stuff. Kind of what Barstool Sports is doing right now is what I wanted to do with sports talk radio 15, 16 years ago. Mm-hmm. Do something that's going to incorporate other elements as opposed to, so last night's game, such and such had 12 rebounds and 5 assists, and can get that anywhere. What am I going to do to set myself apart that you're going to listen to me tomorrow? And that's what I did for a number of years. But I never wanted to pigeonhole myself of being into sports radio. But it was a good gig for the time.
So now that you're doing this, what is your opinion on the state of radio today?
Well, when I was in radio, my opinions were the same. Very recently, I believe there was a bipartisan bill that they were introducing in Congress to keep AM radio in regular cars, because the newer models are probably going to take terrestrial radio off, and that you will link up, whether you have satellite radio or you hook your Bluetooth up or whatever the case is. The problem with regular radio is the same problem that television and newspapers went through, and it's lack of adapting and lack of foresight in the late 90s, early 2000s into the internet. And I always equated it to what rock stations did in the early 80s, when this television station, I don't know if anyone remembers this, they used to show music videos. It was called like music television. There might have been an acronym there.
And sounds vaguely familiar.
Yeah, exactly. They remember it used to have music. That was fun. You actually turned it on and you could see music videos on your music television station. And a lot of radio stations, especially in rock radio, wanted to fight MTV. They wanted to fight against it. They said, see, we're the anti-MTV. See, we still have music and we're not all about the glitz and the glam and the fashion. And sure enough, a lot of those stations flipped formats. They got very, what they call modal, very formulaic, very homogenistic. And MTV, though it's not the same, is still thriving to this day. While a lot of those jocks ended up working overnight shifts or whatever the case, or had to leave radio altogether. Radio did not adapt in the 90s to the internet. They didn't start putting streaming services on their websites for somebody who may have loved your radio station, but had to move across the country. And instead, you just told them, well, screw you, you moved, so you can't listen to us. Why not have an opportunity to let them listen to their old favorite station, but they live across the country in San Diego? And so they didn't adapt to that until a long time. Then they decided to get on board with the apps. And it's a lack of creativity. At this point now in radio, your local jock is probably not your local jock, meaning the guy who's on there or the girl who's doing the music is like, hey, what's going on, everybody? That was the Black Keys with their hit song, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, hey, it's Tony with you up until midnight tonight. We're having a good time. And he realized, oh, Tony is not from my hometown. Tony is doing 7 different radio stations, voice tracking, and making $30,000 a year. Not at each radio station, total. So you're not making a lot of money. It's not glamorous anymore. It is a literally dying industry, meaning your audience is dying by the day. And the people who are here, you're not reaching out to millennials. Millennials are not listening. I don't think Gen Z even knows what a radio is. So you're at that point where all old media, TV, newspapers, and radio, you're educating and informing older people. There's nothing wrong with that, but understand that it's not going to last very long.
Yeah. And it's funny when you were bringing that up, I was thinking of like a lot of like the early club DJs, probably from like the 70s and the 80s. Like, yeah, when I worked the clubs, you had to sync up the records and, had to swing it back. And, but now, somebody with a phone, you just be like, I could just push this button, do the exact same thing. You will that work.
Yeah, it's amazing that, because I did mobile DJing too. And you're bringing all a Chevy Cobalt, a 2-door Cobalt, and I'm putting speaker stands. I've got a subwoofer. I've got this, and this. And I realized, all I probably need now is a phone and auxiliary cord, and then maybe a little board or just an iPad. I've seen this where a lot of places just have an iPad and they control their audio, and it's unlimited music. And it's amazing how things have changed in the last decade now. And it's making the other thing is doing the mobile DJing when everybody has touch tunes. So why do you want to pay a DJ when you just pay for a touch tunes at your bar? Mm-hmm. And everybody can sing along to Sweet Caroline or God only knows what they can for $2 or $3 if you want to play it next.
Now, I agree with what you're saying with radio and everything. Do you think that podcasting will eventually kind of get like that? It'll kind of hit its, I don't know, its saturation point. Well,
it probably is already.
Like just being stale.
Yeah, I think with podcasting, video element, one thing I look at and what I try to do on my podcast, not as much as I probably should, is including a video element. Because you're in New York, right? So I remember watching Mike and the Mad Dog when they would be on, was it the Yes Network or was it Yes? Okay. So they would do their show and I wake up and it's Mike and the Mad Dog. What do you say? Dog, I'm going to talk about, Neil O'Donnell's coming back to the Jets today. And they're like, all right. And it's just two people on a screen talking. And I'm thinking, why don't you put highlights? Why don't you give it a reason? Or Don Imus when he was on MSNBC. Mm-hmm. I remember telling my mom, this guy looks like a melted candle. Why am I watching him on television? This cowboy hat going, oh, you big jerk. Charles McCord, he's coming. And was funny because you got to add a little bit of an element. So with YouTube, there's Rumble, there's all these other video platforms on top of podcasting. I think the one thing is you attach yourself to networks, you do that as far as podcasters go. For people listening to podcasts, I think it's the same way as listening to regular music, that when you mention true crime, there's a lot of people who just look up on their podcast app, true crime podcast, and whatever gets the most listens, the cream's going to rise to the top.
Right.
So I think a lot of it's algorithm. It's how you tag things, how people can find you, what's going to set you apart, making sure that your niche podcast is not too niche where you only get two people listening and one of them is you because you uploaded it. So it's a tricky situation, and it's eventually everybody's going to have their own podcast to talk to, but they usually don't last that long. The good podcasters that stick around are people who really like doing it. They'll do it for several years. Most podcasts go away after, what they say, maybe 20 episodes, 15 episodes, maybe 5.
Right.
Could be. So to be honest, I don't know what the future is with that. I don't know what the next step is. You got to believe there probably is something. I didn't think 10 years ago we were going to get to a point where all those CDs, all those tapes, all of those records that you would buy back in the day, it would be completely irrelevant. That why would you pop a CD and that has a potential to skip when I can just, the amount of times I remember paying for Radiohead's Pablo Honey, which probably cost me $16 for one album that I only liked maybe one song on the album. Or I can go to Spotify Premium for like $12 a month and get tens of millions of songs. Never thought we would have gotten to that point this quick. Right. So I don't know what it's going to be like in the next 5 years, but as a podcaster, as somebody who's seen the rise and the fall of blogs, of Tumblr, of Vine, of everything that's come and gone and things that have stuck around, TikTok is one thing that I'm shrugging my shoulders. I'm not on TikTok. I sometimes wonder if I'm behind the curve there, that everybody else kind of passed me, but I'm actually waiting for the next TikTok. What's going to be the next thing? So I'm open to it, but will I adapt? Who knows?
Yeah, that's true. I remember, the early 2000s when MySpace was the big thing. Oh, you're not on MySpace. And then now, like, nobody's on MySpace, or MySpace is actually, I think, a completely different animal now. I think it's like music oriented and not too much beyond that. So, I always wonder with like Facebook, there were rumblings. I thought that Twitter was going to be the next to go to the software graveyard, with all the political stuff that was going on. You're right. There's really always something around the corner. I guess it's being able to anticipate what that thing is going to be.
Yeah, you have to be open to it. For me, TikTok kind of came out of nowhere very quick. And I started seeing the clientele who was starting it, because I used to work for Radio Disney back in the day too. So we would go to different schools. And then when Radio Disney went away in 2014, we started a new company to still entertain kids. And I was DJing and going into schools. And I started seeing in real time the change in music and these songs that were only 2 minutes long and these songs that were all dance oriented. And I realized, what is this? And they're like, oh, that's from TikTok. Kids are finding it on TikTok. And then they're just scrolling through with this algorithm and they hear this music. So if you go on to the top pop charts, a lot of this stuff is discovered first on TikTok. And I'm like, whoa, this is a new thing. So what is the next thing going to be? Within 5 years, there's probably going to be 2 or 3 more next things.
I would not doubt it at all. So I want to, let people know a little bit about your podcast as well. I noticed, some of your episodes, and not all of them, because I know you really have a wide swath of topics that you do cover on your show. And it's interesting that, you can have one day where you're interviewing maybe like Larry Hankin, and then there's another day, you're talking politics and, two completely different things. Do you ever get any sort of flack for that? Or people are just they're going to like what they like and they'll kind of look at you in that light?
So this is kind of, my podcast is more of a continuation of what I did in radio, which you think about a regular talk radio station, you can talk to a politician, an athlete, and I don't know, the lady down the street who sells milk because she has a cow in her backyard. And in 1 hour, that's just how it happens. And the way I looked at it is I kind of used the Joe Rogan method, where I'll look at who Joe Rogan has on his podcast and I will see Jordan Peterson will be on. So, okay, he's going to be on and talk about, you should clean your room and, whatever. And it's a 5-hour conversation. And then the next episode is Bert Kreischer talking about how he got drunk in Russia and is taking his shirt off. Then the next episode is a horticulturalist and talking about Terrence McKenna and you're squeegeeing your third eye. And the next one is Ari Shafir talking about how he used to say racial slurs on Twitter until he got kicked off. And then it's something else. So the way I looked at it is, if I'm looking at a Joe Rogan playlist and I see 10 podcasts, I'll probably listen to 3 of them. But I like the 3. I like the guest, or maybe I'll be surprised. Maybe the guest that I like, Joey Diaz is going to be on. I'll listen to that. And I'm like, I heard him tell this story. I'll click it off. But then I'll be surprised by somebody else. So my thing is variety. I'm a firm believer in giving people a little bit more. So if you don't like this week's podcast, stay tuned. You might like next week's. If you don't like next week's or last week's, maybe I'm not the podcast for you. That's the way I've looked at it, where I've always never liked to be pigeonholed. Even when I was in high school, I hung out with the goth kids, the jocks, the stoners, the theater kids. I always like to be very well-rounded. I like to showcase that, I'll talk to somebody who was the brand manager at the Levi Strauss, who got let go because she opposed a lot of the COVID stuff. And then the next week I could have Dave Thomas from SCTV. We could talk about hosers and Bob and Doug McKenzie. That kind of stuff is what I really liked. So I like to give people a little bit of everything. And if you don't like it, then you have 2 options. You can either check out next week, you might like next week, or maybe there's another podcast that scratches you where you itch a little bit better than mine. That's just the way I look at it.
Yeah. I get what you're saying, because we do a lot of different mixes here, because I'll have the interviews with celebrities and interviews with podcasters, and there might be people who enjoy one more than the other, and they might be like, well, why do I want to listen to this if I don't listen to podcasts? If I don't want to listen to other types of podcasts or whatever, I just want to hear celebrity interviews, then they're just going to stick with those. And actually, to your point earlier, it's interesting that we're doing this, for a while, for a couple of years, and you still get the people that, when they say, what do you do? And you say, well, I have a podcast, and they go, what's a podcast?
Yeah, exactly.
It's
holding people's hands, because I think a lot of people, here's how I tell people who are, let's say, let's go baby boomers. So people who are about 60 plus that don't heard a podcast, they hear, they'll watch the news stuff, like, check us out. We got if you want more, we have a podcast on this. I'm like, podcast? I keep hearing podcasts. I don't know what you're talking about. Pod. What is a pod? What is a cast? What is a podcast? And the way I look at it is, I tell them a podcast is kind of like the old Dick Cavett show, where Dick Cavett, instead of being a normal, like the Mike Douglas show or Johnny Carson, where they'll have 2 guests, a musical act and a juggler, a monologue, and this and that. It was, or later with Bob Costas, it's one guest, usually one guest, or maybe a couple people, but they're all a part of this. And that's the show. It's not like, my next guest, or we'll make you wait for, I've got an opening segment and monologue and this and that we'll go to our commercial. And no, it's, you have usually one guest or 1 or 2 guests, and it's a long form conversation. It could last 20 minutes. It could last 6 hours, and it could be anywhere in between. Could have some commercials, may not have commercials. And it's like, if you want a very good conversation, if you want to hear people really break it down where it's not quick sound bites, if it's not like the old radio conducted probably hundreds, maybe thousands of interviews in my day of working in radio. And people are like, oh, I didn't get a chance to hear that interview today. And it's like, yeah, because it only lasted 4 minutes because we had to get to a traffic and a weather update and then the commercial update. And we had a sponsor for this and we had to do this. And you're like, wow, the hour's already over. And I was only able to talk to you for a couple of minutes. So it's nice long form conversation. I think people do appreciate that nowadays, that you get to hear a little bit more context as opposed to quick sound bites.
Yeah. And you were saying before we started recording that, in radio, when they would do the interviews, they'd have to get those certain questions out. And it wasn't necessarily like a real conversation. It was just like, let's get those answers out and then we'll kind of move on. Where a podcast, you take your time. You have, you can have a 6-hour podcast if you really wanted to.
Good. Yeah. I'm trying to think of the longest podcast I've done. I did a 3-hour podcast over the summer. Oh. And even at that time, remember it. Probably shouldn't tell people this, but I will. I had a water bottle next to me because I'm like, I'm not getting up to pee, so I'm gonna pretend. And I'm on video too, so I just that's great, yeah, okay, yeah, and I'm sitting there going I have to go to the bathroom. What am I gonna do? I'm stuck in a podcast.
Oh, I'm trapped.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like good thing I had that zipper. Good thing I could just pull. Never mind. But it was. You can do that. And that's what I like about the medium, is that you can get creative. You can book. And that's the other thing. I had a podcast recently about, it was a guy who had a book on Shemp from the Three Stooges. Mm-hmm. And I got a comment from somebody on my YouTube page. And I normally don't respond to comments, but it kind of ticked me off because it was the first thing I saw in the morning. And then I'm like, all right, now I'm up. I'm ready to go. And this guy's like, you're talking about Shemp? Nobody cares about Shemp. This is why, you probably don't get many people watching or listening to your podcast and stuff. And I realized, look, I worked in radio for 15 years. I was a producer. I booked a lot of people. I also filled in hosting, and I hosted my own shows. And I talked to a lot of people that I didn't like talking to, or didn't want to, didn't care to. I was forced to. Oh, quick side note as I tell the story. There was one time I had a radio show, and I was interviewing a woman who owned a local stable in our area. And it was a stable that it was a pony who would go to the local children's hospital that would cheer the kids up who are, not doing so well. And cool story is like, as far as news, but to have on for a 10-minute interview, and that's a lot. I'm like, there's a lot of people I didn't really want to talk to all that long. So I decided, this is my podcast. I'm my own host. I'm my own producer. I'm my own executive producer. I'm my own salesman. I'm my own promotions. I'm my own behind the scenes guy. I've got all the accounts in order to put my podcast, my YouTube, the Podbean, which is my host site, the Patreon, my Rumble, my Vimeo, my this and that. I'm the sole owner, sole proprietor of my podcast. So if I want to talk to somebody about Shemp Howard from the Three Stooges, well, gosh darn it, I'm going to talk about Shemp Howard from the Three Stooges. So I always looked at that as, this is my opportunity where I can do what I want. You're the listener. You have an opportunity. You have a choice. You're like, oh, I like the Three Stooges. I would hear that. Or couldn't care less about a guy who died nearly 70 years ago. I don't care about the Three Stooges. Never found them funny. So you don't have to listen. So that's how I looked at it. And I'm like, at least now I get an opportunity to take ownership of my show and do things that I enjoy.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you brought up Shemp as an example, because I find there are people, especially like, I'm old, I'm much older than you are, but you can tell that you actually are a younger person who's definitely has like some sort of a sense of nostalgia that you actually know who the Three Stooges are.
Oh, yeah.
I've spoken to people about like the Marx Brothers or the Beatles, and they're like, who are you talking about? There's like no appreciation of that early media.
Well, you know what I think that is back in the day, we had an opportunity for show like all the variety shows and everything. I'm saying collectively and you would watch the Ed Sullivan Show.
Yeah.
Because everybody watched the Ed Sullivan Show. And you heard that the Rolling Stones are going to be on, and you're a huge Stones fan. This is great. Oh my gosh, I'm going to get to watch it. But they're going to be on probably towards the end. And there's only 3 options for TV. Depending on where your market is, to be 5 stations. But you only had a finite amount of chances to see anything. Like, it's either that or you stare at the wall and read a book. So you watched The Ballet Dancer. You watched Marty Allen and Steve Rossi perform stand-up. Then you watch The Juggler and you watch Topo Gigio, and then the Rolling Stones eventually came on. So you were cultured in things that you wouldn't think you liked. So nowadays we have so many options, whether it is podcasting, whether it is watching television, that is so you can be in your own element all the time and not know that there are other options out there that you could like, hey. So I think that's why younger people don't appreciate the classics, because they've never grown up with them. They have an opportunity where you can create a universe of entertainment for yourself. Therefore, they're not even in your view. And the only time a lot of that is when somebody will put old school elements into movies or TikTok. So sometimes a song will get really big because somebody included in a very popular TikTok, or the Guardians of the Galaxy movies would have classic rock in them. So these kids are like, hey, I like REO Speedwagon. Hey, I'm into what is this, 38 Special? I've never heard of them, but I like this. And it's because they have to be massaged. They have to have their hands held figuratively or sometimes literally into listening to this, and then they get a better appreciation for it.
And also, I think now, especially, I think, and this is a generalization because I know this doesn't probably apply to everybody who might be hearing this. I think like 20 somethings and under, they now have like 10,000 choices and 500 channels to look at. So you can pick and choose whatever you want to see, because the words on demand didn't exist for, anybody, growing up in the 80s or 90s. It was, that didn't really come till later. Now, it's just all there. Now it's just everybody's looking things up on YouTube.
Yeah. I mean, we can't, what I think was good for us when we were kids is being bored. Because what do you do with boredom? Do you go for a bike ride? Do you go for a hike? Do you read a book? Do you watch summer replacement shows and reruns on television? What do you do? And I sit around sometimes. My wife and I will work different schedules, and I'll come home and I can sit on my couch if I want to and just be bored, but there's no really opportunity to. What do you do? I can watch TV. I can find something. I remember during COVID, when things were locked down and there was no sports on. So what I do is I went on YouTube and I found sports from 1992. And I watched the Oakland A's versus the Boston Red Sox at Fenway Park in 1992, Ron Darling versus Roger Clemens on the mound and whatever. And I'm like, okay, so I don't need sports then. I have sports. It's just old school sports. Right. I know how this one ends. I can look it up on Baseball Reference to see who won this game if I want to, or I can be surprised at Dave Stewart throwing a shutout against, whoever was on the Red Sox at the time. I don't remember, Aaron Seeley. But I can do that. And I think that was a key thing for us growing up, is that feeling of what it was like to just sigh and go, I'm so bored. You could do whatever you want nowadays. There's just too many options. So is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? I don't know. Well, I guess we'll see down the road.
I'm getting the feeling that you've got a wide love for podcasts, and you probably listen to a lot of different stuff.
Yes, my podcast queue is pretty. It's pretty. It's kind of all over the place, but I like listening to some daily podcasts that come out. But then also, I don't want it to be too heavy about what's going on in the news and anything. That sometimes, so one of my friend of mine, name drop, my friend Jim Florentine. And I'll listen to a podcast that talks about, Israel and Palestine and all the things going on, or the election happening. And then Jim Florentine has this podcast that I'll break up everything, where he talks about people who have awful vanity plates. And he'll rip out like, why'd you have to get that? Is that went into the DMV and you said, I want a plate that says tater tot because you like tater tots. Is that, who does that? And I'm like, okay, that breaks it up a little bit. Then I can go to the other serious stuff and every so often just bounce it around. It's nice to listen to something different. Dr. Steve from Weird Medicine, I do listen to, and it's what it is. People have weird things that happen to their body. They'll call in, and you have accredited doctors who will answer them. Although it's weird, because I've listened to Weird Medicine for a number of years, and it started off as people like guys calling in like, why do my farts smell so bad? And then those same people will call in 10 years later and say, hey, doc, I have a serious problem. There's this mole that's here, and I'm not sure if it's like, I can't tell if that's the progression of the podcast or regression.
So when you were doing comedy, who would you say were probably your comic influences?
So I'm actually still doing comedy. I just don't do it that often. having a day job, and especially when I was working in radio, it's tough to go on the road. It's tough to do. So I did a lot more local stuff here in Ohio. Mm-hmm. When we're recording this, I'm doing comedy this weekend. So I don't do it all that often. I don't have the love for it that I used to. But my influences when I started, I would say if I'm to put a comedy Mount Rushmore, Dave Attell was a huge influence on me. Louis C.K., Bill Hicks, and probably Norm Macdonald. Because I know it's very cliched for comedians to say, well, of course, Richard Pryor and George Carlin. And I always appreciated George Carlin, Richard Pryor. But remember, we didn't have HBO or Showtime growing up. And I was too young as a kid to go to a comedy club. So I never went to a comedy show until it was 18. Mm-hmm. So I was raised, when it came to my comedy background, on Marx Brothers, on the Little Rascals, Our Gang, all the Hal Roach stuff, Three Stooges, of course, Laurel and Hardy, and Looney Tunes. Those are my influences as a kid. So when I eventually got into doing some form of entertainment, they were my backbone. So I really appreciated that. But then as I got into comedy, the one thing that's all four of the comics that I had mentioned as my main influences, that can take things really, really dark into dark places, but it's because they have experienced those dark places themselves and they have something to write about. It's, it's not phony.
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to say, it was funny that you say that everybody always says Carlin and Pryor, and you can have those four names. I was like, well, that's a refreshing take on who are your influences.
Well, Lenny Bruce. And I didn't get into Lenny Bruce. I never did, but because of him, it's what he was saying at the time is so groundbreaking. Yet by the time you get to the 80s and the 90s, you can say whatever you want on television. It's named, and the taboos had been broken. So do I appreciate? I love George Carlin. I think I was sad the day he died. A lot of the great stuff that he had and his reinventing his career so many different times. And of course, Richard Pryor, from what he did in the 60s into the 70s, and then he gets into acting, and then he has the MS, and he just wasn't able to have the long-lasting career that I think a lot of people expected. So are they an influence? Sure. They just my main influence. I just really appreciate them.
Right. Kind of laid the groundwork for other people who really probably affected you a little bit better.
Yeah, I would say, I'm trying to think if there's any comics that I have not seen live, many of whom I've worked with, that been on stage with. If not, I've just hung out with them after the show and gotten to see them. I've gone to the Comedy Store and the Hollywood Improv. I've been around the New York clubs and stuff. I know a bunch of them. I'm on a first name basis with a lot of these comics. Some of them, not so much. Some of them I will pay to go see them. Like I saw Andrew Dice Clay. And here's what's interesting about Dice is Dice, when I saw him, it was so fascinating because you're expecting, I don't know what to expect. You just remember him back in the day. He was all over the place, and then he kind of dropped off. He had a comeback, but it just wasn't the same Dice land where it was him and Sam Kinison, that era of being angry about everything. And you realize what a brilliant comic he is. And I got to see him live. I was up in Detroit one time, and he was performing at this venue and I'm almost on the floor laughing so hard. There've only been a few comics where I've actually fallen onto the chair, almost onto the floor of laughing so hard. And Dice was actually one of them. I was very shocked.
It was interesting because if you see his early performances, he was a hell of an impressionist.
Yeah, he was. For people who don't know, the Dice character is Jerry Lewis's Buddy Love. That's what it is he did characters. He was a huge Jerry Lewis fan. Mm-hmm. So he would do the errand boy, and he would do the bellhop, and he was in the caddy. He would do all the Jerry Lewis, he would do all that. But then when he would do the Buddy Love, ultimately, and what we found out about Jerry Lewis is that he loved doing the Buddy Love character. That's who the real Jerry was. He didn't want to be the goofy, nebbish kind of guy. He wanted to be the tough guy smoking cigarettes and meaning business. And that's what Dice leaned into, was that he was doing Vinnie Barbarino because that was big at the time when he started. And Dice, if you see episodes, he was in MASH. He was in, was it Different Strokes, I think? He was doing guest appearances there. And so he's actually a really good actor. And
yes,
we saw it a couple of years ago when he was in the Star is Born remake.
Yes. did a double take. And I was like, wait a minute, is that Andrew Dice Clay? He was like,
everybody did that.
And
Yep.
he had this really great part. He was really impressive.
His Instagram is so funny because he'll just go up to random people on the street and go like, do I have to take another picture with you? Yes, I get it. I'm a big celebrity. And they're like, who is this? Who's this guy taking? It's just, he's trolling everybody. It was so great. Another great comic that I have seen. There's a couple who have since passed that really appreciated was Patrice O'Neill. I did get to see him a couple of times. And you want to talk about the growth of a comedian. I saw Patrice in 2006 and I thought he was really funny. I saw him in 2010. He was otherworldly good. And a lot of it is because he was doing early podcasting. He had a show kind of like Dr. Phil, but he called it the Black Phillip Show. And he was doing a lot of guest appearances on radio shows, the Opie and Anthony show specifically. And his comedy, because of that, actually grew, and he would go into different subjects. He did a whole special, the Elephant in the Room special, his last one, is almost all crowd work. He's doing no one does crowd work on a special. He did it, and it was so brilliant. But problem was he was 500-600 pounds. He was a diabetic. He openly talked about he's not going to live that long, and sure enough, he didn't. He had a stroke, and it just was too debilitating. They took him off. But I did get to see him about a year before he had passed. And I was blown away, falling off the chair at the Cleveland Improv, just laughing so hard. And then Gilbert Gottfried's another one that Gilbert was a classic example of. So I've seen Gilbert twice as well. And I took an ex-girlfriend because we were in Pittsburgh at the time and it was pouring rain. We were at a Pirates game. And I said, do you want to leave? And she's like, where do you want to go next? You want to go home? And I said, no. I would like to go see Gilbert Gottfried doing the Late Show at the Pittsburgh Improv. She's like, yeah, because she was a huge Disney fan and I loved Gilbert. And that was an example of I'm falling all over the place. And I remembered sitting next to a couple and Gilbert's doing impressions of Hervé Villachez, Ben Gazzara, Groucho Marx, all of that on stage. And the boyfriend of this table, the boyfriend is falling all over laughing. And the girlfriend's just staring and saying, this isn't the guy from Aladdin. What is this? What am I watching? And that made the show even better. And so about a year plus ago, I went to New York. I was at the City Winery and they were doing a send-off to Gilbert Gottfried, that they were doing a whole show. I got a chance to meet John Davidson from That's Incredible. Mm-hmm. Jason Alexander was there, Craig Bierko, Mario Cantone. Who else did I meet? Rupert Holmes, the guy who did the Pina Colada song. And Gilbert's wife was there, Dara. And so I talked to Dara for a while and told her that story. And she gave me a huge hug. And she's like, that's what Gilbert loved the best is he loved people laughing, but he also liked people looking at him indifferently. That he used to do. Artie Lang tells a great Gilbert story that they were at a show with college kids in San Diego. And Gilbert ends the show by singing You'll Never Walk Alone, the Jerry Lewis Telethon ending credits theme. And he said that people are leaving in packs because they're like, what is this? Why is he singing this? And he's singing it as Jerry. Realize it's not for everybody, but it's my niche type of humor that I've always enjoyed.
I actually got to meet Gilbert as well. He played at a comedy club in the nearby Podcastia area. And after the show, they autographed and posted pictures and stuff. And whatever people think of him, he was like the nicest, sweetest person. And
really was.
I actually asked him if he wanted to come on the podcast. And he was very polite. He said, I am so busy. He said, I couldn't even possibly find the time, to do it. He said, but, thank you for asking. And I was like, hey, I get it. And I guess because he was probably touring during the summer as well.
And he was also, if this is in the last couple of years, he was doing his own podcast, which is actually a really, really good podcast that they had old school golden age Hollywood people and musicians and stuff. So his podcast is one of them that, he's been gone since April of 2022. I'll still go back and listen to his podcast. It's so weird to think that Norm Macdonald, which again, another one that I never got a chance to meet him, but I saw him a couple of times. There's so much content out there nowadays because of podcasting, because of YouTube, that somebody could die and it doesn't matter because you still have a lifetime's worth of material that's out there for them.
Yeah. They create their own radio legacy.
Yeah, well, and now with AI, you could just plug their voice in. You just have it for our eternity. Have AI holograms of Norm Macdonald telling you the Dirty Johnny jokes.
Crack whore.
Yeah, it's they say about the biggest export to Vegas are the whores. It's just that cadence. That's what I loved about Norm. Norm was my first over 21 comedy show that I got a chance to see, and just seeing how brilliant he is, because he makes it seem like he's on stage. It was almost like Foster Brooks. It was performance art. So people remember Foster Brooks. He was and he would hiccup and he would just stumble his words. He wasn't drunk. He just did a character. Right. And so Norm would go on stage going like, yes. Yeah, you ever go to dinner and you want to get a pork chop? Yeah, pork chop. And it's the only place that before you eat, they give you a whole loaf of bread. Like, you don't get that at home. I'm gonna loaf of bread before dinner, honey. And he did that on stage, making it seem like it was a throwaway line. Then 3 years later, he puts a special out, and it's like he did that word for word. It was brilliant. Like you think he's just like, just had a pork chop for dinner. It's like, wow, he must have had a lot of pork chops, because he also had a pork chop that night when he recorded the show.
Okay. So just so people want to get in touch with you and follow you on social media, we have something called shameless self-promotion. Yes. So you know a little bit about that, Tony, if you can let everybody know where they can find you.
Shameless self-promotion.
So I'm not calling it Twitter. I'm not calling it X. It's always going to be Twitter to me. It's
known as.
Yeah, it's the Prince thing over. It's like, you're still Prince. I don't care what symbol you claim to be, but it's Tony Mazur, TonyMazur on Twitter. I did not get Tony Mazur on Instagram, only because when I signed up Instagram, you want to talk about a social media site that has changed a lot. When I signed up for Instagram, I just thought it was a picture site, kind of like Photo Bucket or whatever. You just post pictures. I didn't realize it was going to be a social media phenomenon where people connect and, I don't know, go on dates and meet up with people and thirst trap bikini clad thong photos of girls. I'm like, I didn't think that was going to happen. But so when I signed up, I just put just a regular dumb username, which is TMaze25, as in Mazur, and it was my number back in the day, my lucky number. And so the Tony Mazur that's on there, if you try to follow it, it's a guy who has like 11 photos, and they're all of goats. He took pictures of his goats and sheep from 8-9 years ago, and I couldn't get that account. So it's TMaze25 on Instagram, but it's Tony Mazur basically everywhere else, Facebook as well. And my podcast goes out for free every Wednesday. It's called the Check Your Brain Podcast. So if you subscribe, you listen, it pops up every Wednesday morning. I've been doing it at the end of December. Since, again, I'm an old radio guy, I like doing the year in review. So the biggest news stories, celebrity deaths, the biggest stuff in sports that's happened. And so go check that out. That's this week's podcast is, well, what's happened in sports this year, from Shohei Ohtani's signing to the Pac-12 going away and Bally Sports going bankrupt. And, Bobby Hull died this past year, and Brooks Robinson, Jim Brown, all those people and stuff. So that's what I have on there. But if you want more content where I rip on pop culture and the news and telling people to get married and everything, go to patreon.com/Tony Mazur. Just $3 a month. You get about 20 to 25 podcasts per month there for just $3 at patreon.com/Tony Mazur.
Check Your Brain is the podcast. Tony Mazur, he's the host, the guy without the goats.
No, just a goatee. And my wife hates it, but she loves everything 90s. And I said, hey, you love the 90s, so why not get a goatee?
You got to do the big Luke Perry sideburns too, right?
Well, yeah, and I was also going to get a tattoo of barbed wire, and I was going to drink Zima with Jolly Ranchers. So just to make all the 90s stuff ready.
There you have it. Tony, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Now it's time for Sherpa Samples. If you've got a podcast you'd like us to sample, contact us, and we'll mention your name on the show.
It is time for Sherpa Samples, and this is the portion of the show where I get to do my little deep dive into Mount Podcastia and check out some of the podcasts that are on the podcast charts. And that's what we're going to do right now. I got an exciting 10 for you this time around. And I must say that I'm really impressed with a lot of the podcasts that I listen to in this segment. Uncharted with Hannah Fry. Now, Hannah Fry's name doesn't sound familiar. A while back, we talked about a science podcast called The Curious Cases of Rutherford and Fry, and it is the same Dr. Hannah Fry, who is a mathematician, and in this episode, she uses maths and charts to explain why there was an excessive amount of boy births in 1972 and 1973 in Great Britain. It sounds kind of dry, but it's actually really interesting. It was definitely worth checking out. Dark Arenas is a podcast about a lot of occupations that people don't normally have, and the episode that I checked out had to do with being a Secret Service agent, and they interviewed a former Secret Service agent, and he gave some of the stories of his career there. Are You Garbage is hosted by two comics, and they interview other comedians, and they ask them all sorts of questions, and I guess they determine if they're garbage or not. The two hosts are admittedly garbage, so it's not going to be too judgy here. You know, they have things like, did you own a George Foreman grill? Okay, I guess I'm not going on that show. In the real life stories, I listened to Small Town Dicks, which is hosted by Yardley Smith, who the voice of Lisa Simpson on The Simpsons, so you know her voice. And she speaks with these two twins who were investigators and a forensic expert. And the episode that I checked out was a tale from the forensic expert's history and this one case that seems to haunt him. And he talks about all the details of the case. It was really heavy stuff. Also, there was the Bakersfield Three. This had to do with actual events with three people in Bakersfield, California, that were actually all associated with each other, and two of them went missing, and one of them ended up murdered as well. The kids of Rutherford County had to do with happenings in this area where a lot of the Black and Latino children were routinely arrested, and it wasn't necessarily over anything that they were doing, but it was just an investigation as to why they were being investigated. For example, the episode that I listened to had to do with two small children getting into a fight on a basketball court, but they arrested a lot of the children who saw this, and even some of the children that were arrested weren't even there. So you can see the controversy that's going to be in that podcast. Really interesting stuff, though, and really well done. As far as the spooky stories, there were lots of spooky stories this time around. Uncanny is brought to you by the BBC and has to do with a lot of scary stories. This one had to do with the mysterious blue man, people seeing a blue man in their house. Ooh. If you hear that episode, it's really creepy, by the way. Ghost Story is actually a ghost story and a true crime podcast because the narrator thinks that the ghost was his wife's grandmother who was murdered. Ooh, spooky stuff going on there. And to round it out, the Lovecraft Investigations is a fictional audio drama, which was really well done, by the way. And that also has to do with a lot of paranormal activity. And they always suggest that you listen to the story from the beginning, and I don't listen, so. But I thought it was really well done regardless. And lastly, there is a new podcast by Trevor Noah. And Trevor Noah is the current host of The Daily Show. And his podcast is called What Now? And I got to listen to the debut episode where he spoke to Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. And it was a really interesting interview. He's a good interviewer anyway. Let's see where that podcast takes him. I'm sure it's going to be really interesting regardless. And regardless of if it's interesting or not, how do you like how I led onto that one? We will segue smoothly into the outro.
Be a rebel. Follow the show at Sherpolution on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook.
Thank you so much to Tony Mazur for popping by the show, and be sure to check out his podcast, Check Your Brain, wherever you're hearing this podcast or any other podcast as well. If you like this show, you know what you could do. Please leave me a nice review on Apple Podcasts, and if you do, let me know. You can be entered into a contest where you could win free podcast merchandise. Woohoo! Really cool. And you can follow the show on social media. Sherpolution is the word, of course. Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok. We've got all the news on the show right there. So follow along. say hello to the Sherpa, and have a great day. And Lord, Mr. Bruce and I will be heading on out of here, and we will be seeing you the next time. So until then, viva la Sherpolution.
Thanks for listening to Too Many Podcasts. Please disperse. You can go home now. I said you can go home now. Viva la Sherpolution. Viva la Sherpolution. Oh. I'll come back now, you hear?
You know, Rebels, if you've been checking out some of my promotional ads on social media, you will be aware that I have been using a lot of AI programs to help me create ads. But you know what? There's a lot more uses for AI than just funny little videos. And I'd like to introduce one of our new sponsors, Podium. It is a leader in creating AI tools for podcasters. Now, let's say you've got a podcast, or maybe you're even thinking of doing a podcast. You're probably wondering, well, how can AI be integrated with your workflow? I'll tell you about Podium. As a podcaster, you know that writing show notes and creating chapters and transcribing episodes takes a lot of time, and it can cost you a lot of money too. But you know what? That's where Podium comes in. It's an AI tool designed specifically for creators and podcasters with the goal of making post-production tasks quick and easy. And in just a few minutes, Podium generates show notes, chapters, summaries, clips for social media, a full transcript, suggested episode titles, social media posts, and more. Whew, that's a lot of work for one little program. Your show notes are key to your podcast success because it helps new listeners find your podcast and they'll know if it's a fit for them. You know, kind of like Too Many Podcasts. It also improves your SEO, that's your search engine optimization. Ooh, big phrase there. And overall accessibility. And with Podium, you can focus on creating a great podcast and let Podium's AI do the heavy lifting. But Podium isn't just for solo creators and podcasters. It's a game changer for editors, producers, marketers, agencies, and production studios. Teams that use Podiums are able to increase workloads, decrease turnaround times, and improve their quality. How does it work? Very easy. First, go to Podium's website, and you'll see that link that's right there in the show notes. You get 3 hours free just to try it. Pretty cool, huh? And using that link also supports this show as well. And you know what else happens? Because I'm a good guy. You use my link, you will get 50% off for your first month. So visit the site, upload an MP3 file, and download your files. And that's it. And if you need anything else, you can use Podium GPT to generate articles and any marketing copy you might need in seconds. Instant show notes, transcripts, chapters for your podcast or channel. This will level up that podcast. So check out Podium today.